"You should sit at the end of the table tonight, Evelyn," my daughter-in-law said with a polished smile. "The closer seats are for immediate family." I looked at Vanessa for a moment, certain I had misunderstood her. The dining room of Daniel's colonial home glowed with soft candlelight and the warm gold of November decorations. Crystal glasses reflected tiny flickers of firelight across the long walnut table I had once helped pay for when my son and his wife first bought the house 12 years ago. Outside, cold Boston rain tapped gently against the windows, but inside, everything looked picture perfect. That was Vanessa's specialty. Everything always looked perfect. "Of course," I said quietly, smoothing the sleeve of my dark green cashmere sweater before moving toward the far end of the table. No one protested. Not Daniel. Not my granddaughter Sophie. Not even the guests already seated with glasses of wine in their hands. I noticed my place card the moment I sat down. Family sponsor. Not Mom. Not Grandma. Not Evelyn Carter. Family sponsor. The white card rested neatly above a gold charger plate, written in elegant calligraphy, as though humiliation somehow became less cruel when paired with beautiful handwriting. Vanessa leaned closer and gave a soft laugh. "Relax. It's just a joke." I smiled politely because women my age learned long ago that dignity often survives best in silence. Then I folded the place card once and slipped it carefully into my purse. The conversation around the table continued as though nothing had happened. Vanessa carried the evening effortlessly, gliding from guest to guest in her cream silk blouse and diamond earrings, touching shoulders lightly as she laughed at stories she'd probably heard before. She was beautiful in the polished, expensive way magazines like to celebrate. 40 years old. Perfect posture. Perfect hair. Perfect control. Daniel barely looked at me the entire evening. My son spent most of dinner refilling wine glasses and nodding whenever Vanessa spoke. There was a time he used to call me every Sunday morning just to ask how long to bake his favorite apple pie. Back then, he still sounded like my little boy from Cambridge who ran through autumn leaves in red rain boots and cried when he scraped his knee on the sidewalk outside our old brownstone. Now he sounded careful around me, measured, like every sentence passed through someone else's approval first. Vanessa planned everything herself, Daniel told one of the guests proudly. "She's incredible at bringing people together." Bringing people together. I lowered my eyes to my untouched sweet potatoes and nearly smiled at the irony. Across the table, Sophie glanced at me briefly. 16 years old, observant in the dangerous way intelligent girls often are. She looked uncomfortable when she noticed the empty seat beside me while the rest of the family clustered together near Vanessa at the center of the table. But she said nothing. Children learn silence from adults. As dinner continued, I watched Vanessa carefully. Not openly. Women like her notice open observation immediately. No, I watched the spaces between things. The small omissions. The tiny adjustments. The way she introduced me to a guest simply as Evelyn, without mentioning I was Daniel's mother. The way family photographs on the hallway wall suddenly contained fewer pictures of me over the years. The way holiday plans somehow stopped including traditions I created decades ago. None of it happened all at once. That was the brilliance of it. Vanessa hadn't tried to remove me from the family. She had simply been erasing me slowly enough that no one noticed the outline fading. Halfway through dessert, Vanessa raised her champagne glass lightly against the crystal chandelier glow. "I think every family has to evolve," she said smoothly. "Sometimes people hold on to old roles too tightly." Several guests nodded politely. Daniel smiled. I stared quietly at the candle nearest my plate and watched the flame tremble slightly in the draft coming from the kitchen. Then, for the first time all evening, I realized something cold and clarifying. Vanessa wasn't trying to hurt me. Hurting me was simply the method. What she truly wanted was my place. I stayed only 20 minutes after dessert, long enough to avoid looking wounded, long enough to preserve what little pride I still had left in that house. Vanessa hugged guests near the doorway while soft Frank Sinatra music drifted through hidden speakers in the ceiling. The smell of cinnamon candles and roasted turkey still lingered in the dining room as I buttoned my wool coat slowly beside the staircase. "Leaving already?" Vanessa asked with surprise polished carefully into her voice. "You barely touched the pie." "I am tired," I said simply. "It has been a long evening." She tilted her head slightly, studying me the way people study antique furniture before deciding whether it still belongs in the room. Well, drive safely. Boston roads are terrible in the rain. Daniel walked me to the front door, but only because Sophie quietly whispered something to him first. My son opened the door and cold November air rushed inside immediately, carrying the scent of wet pavement and chimney smoke. Thanks for coming, Mom, he said distractedly, already glancing back toward the dining room where Vanessa laughed at something one of the guests said. Thanks for coming. As though I had attended someone else's holiday gathering instead of the family traditions I once spent 30 years building with my own hands. I nodded once and stepped outside. Rain misted softly across Beacon Hill as I walked toward my car parked beneath a flickering street lamp. My reflection looked pale in the dark window beside me. Older than 68. Smaller somehow. I sat in the driver's seat without turning the engine on right away. The folded place card rested quietly inside my purse beside my reading glasses and lipstick. Family sponsor. I traced the sharp crease through the paper with my fingertips while memories surfaced one after another with uncomfortable clarity. 3 years ago, Vanessa convinced Daniel to host Christmas at a ski lodge in Vermont because she claimed the city felt too crowded during the holidays. They forgot to tell me the dates had changed until the morning they left. Last spring, Sophie's piano recital invitation arrived 2 days after the performance. Vanessa apologized sweetly and blamed the mail. Before that came smaller things. Family group photographs posted online where I was somehow cropped near the edge. Dinner reservations made for 6 people when there were 7 of us. Conversations that stopped politely whenever I entered the room. None of those moments seemed important individually. Together, they formed something colder, something deliberate. I drove home through quiet streets lined with brownstones glowing warmly behind rain-streaked windows. Most families were still awake, gathered around dining tables or fireplaces, lingering over coffee and pie. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday because it never depended on expensive gifts or grand performances. It was supposed to be simple. Food, memory, family. Somewhere along the way, Vanessa had turned it into theater instead. My townhouse felt painfully silent when I unlocked the front door. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily while the radiator hissed softly against the November cold. I placed my purse carefully on the kitchen counter and removed the folded place card again. Under the bright overhead light, the elegant handwriting looked almost beautiful. I made myself chamomile tea and stood by the kitchen window waiting for the kettle to cool enough to drink. Across the street, my neighbor Mrs. Holloway laughed with her grandchildren while someone carried leftovers inside. I realized then that the loneliness hurting me tonight was not the absence of company. It was the absence of belonging. My eyes drifted toward the framed family photographs along the hallway wall. Daniel graduating from Harvard. Sophie as a little girl wearing rain boots in my garden. One old Thanksgiving picture from nearly 15 years ago where Vanessa stood beside me smiling genuinely before she learned how much influence she could hold over a family simply by controlling the atmosphere inside a room. Back then, she used to ask for my recipes, ask for my advice, ask me to babysit Sophie overnight while she and Daniel went away for weekends. Then slowly, almost invisibly, the questions stopped. I carried my tea upstairs and paused halfway when my phone buzzed softly in my sweater pocket. A text message from Sophie. Just 6 words. Grandma, I saw what you did. I stared at the screen for a long moment while rain continued tapping quietly against the windows. Then, for the first time all evening, I no longer felt completely alone. The next morning, Boston looked washed clean by the overnight rain. Pale sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors of my townhouse, while the city outside slowly woke beneath a thin layer of fog drifting off the Charles River. I barely slept. Sophie's message lingered in my mind long after midnight, repeating itself quietly through every restless hour. Grandma, I saw what you did. At 7:30, I stood in my kitchen grinding fresh coffee beans while the radio played softly near the window. The familiar routine calmed me. Measure the coffee, heat the kettle, slice the orange for breakfast. Small rituals become anchors when larger things begin slipping away. My phone remained face down on the counter beside me. I told myself I would not involve Sophie in whatever was happening between her mother and me. Children should not carry the emotional failures of adults. But at exactly 8:12, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Sophie. Are you home today? I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering yes. Her reply came immediately. Can I stop by after school? Do not tell Mom. Something tightened quietly in my chest. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. By noon, I tried distracting myself with errands around Beacon Hill. I picked up dry cleaning, mailed 2 Christmas cards early, and stopped at the florist on Charles Street where I had bought arrangements for nearly 20 years. Margaret Hill called while I waited for my bouquet of white hydrangeas to be wrapped in brown paper. "How was Thanksgiving?" she asked casually. Margaret and I met during a charity fundraiser decades earlier, and she remained one of the few people who still spoke to me without caution or obligation. I hesitated too long before answering. "Beautiful table settings," I said finally. Margaret was silent for a moment. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "you know polished rooms usually hide the ugliest tensions." I almost laughed because it sounded exactly like something Margaret would say while holding a martini at one of her Back Bay dinner parties. "It was fine," I lied softly. "Of course it was," she replied in a tone that told me she did not believe me at all. Around 3:30 that afternoon, Sophie arrived wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt and white sneakers damp from melted sidewalk slush. I opened the door before she even knocked twice. She hugged me tightly without speaking. That alone told me something was wrong. Sophie had always been affectionate as a child, but teenagers usually replace hugs with quick smiles and distracted hellos. "I brought muffins," she said quietly, lifting a paper bakery bag. "Blueberry. Your favorite." We sat in the kitchen while snow threatened weakly outside the windows. Sophie wrapped both hands around her mug of hot chocolate without drinking it. I waited patiently because silence often invites honesty faster than questions do. Finally, she spoke. "Mom talks about you when you are not around." Her eyes stayed fixed on the steam rising from the mug. I said nothing. "Not always directly," Sophie continued. "It is more like jokes. Comments." My stomach tightened, but my voice remained calm. "What kind of comments?" Sophie swallowed hard. "She says you make people feel guilty for aging. She says families fall apart when older women refuse to let go of control." I looked down at the kitchen table my late husband and I bought during our first year of marriage. The wood had scratches from decades of real life. Homework, birthday cakes, Thanksgiving dinners, Sophie's tiny crayons when she was 5. "And your father?" I asked quietly. Sophie gave a sad little shrug. "Dad usually stays quiet. Sometimes he laughs because he does not want to argue with her." That hurt more than I expected. Not because Daniel failed to defend me, but because I suddenly realized how long he had been afraid of upsetting his own wife. Sophie reached into her backpack carefully and pulled out her phone. "There is something else," she whispered. Then she opened a family group chat I had never seen before. My eyes landed immediately on a message Vanessa sent 3 weeks earlier beside a photograph of me carrying grocery bags outside my townhouse. "Keeping her independent act alive again. One day she is going to force Daniel to choose between us." Several laughing emojis followed beneath it. My fingers became very still around the coffee cup. Sophie looked close to tears. "Grandma," she said softly. "I do not think she even realizes how cruel she sounds anymore." Outside, church bells echoed faintly through the cold Boston afternoon while snow finally began falling in slow, quiet flakes. I stared at the glowing phone screen for a very long time before one clear thought settled quietly into place inside my mind. Vanessa had not simply been excluding me. She had been rewriting me. After Sophie left that evening, I sat alone in my living room long after the tea beside me turned cold. Snow drifted quietly outside the tall windows overlooking the street, softening the noise of passing cars and covering Beacon Hill in the kind of peaceful beauty tourists imagine when they think about Boston in December. Inside my townhouse, the silence felt heavier now. Not empty, revealing. Sophie's phone screen kept replaying in my mind like a private film I had never intended to watch. The photograph of me carrying groceries. The laughing emojis beneath Vanessa's comment. The casual cruelty of it disturbed me less than the ease. Vanessa had not sounded angry. She had sounded entertained. That was what unsettled me most. Cruel people often raise their voices. Truly dangerous people lower them. Around 9 o'clock, I walked slowly through the hallway studying old family photographs beneath the warm glow of the sconces. Daniel at 8 years old holding a carved pumpkin almost larger than his torso. Sophie asleep on my chest as a baby beside the fireplace one snowy Christmas Eve. One photograph stopped me entirely. It had been taken 15 years earlier at a charity gala downtown. Vanessa stood beside me smiling brightly in a pale blue gown, one arm linked gently through mine. I remembered that evening clearly because she had cried in the ladies' room halfway through dinner after feeling overwhelmed by all the wealthy guests and formal speeches. "I never know what to say around people like this," she whispered back then while fixing her lipstick with trembling hands. I had squeezed her shoulder gently and said, "Kindness matters more than polish, Vanessa." At the time, I believed she was nervous. Now I wondered if she had simply been studying the room. The next morning arrived gray and brittle, with freezing temperatures barely reaching 30 degrees. I bundled myself into my wool coat and walked 3 blocks to the bakery near Louisburg Square, mostly because staying inside too long felt dangerous. Loneliness expands in quiet rooms if you let it. The bakery smelled like cinnamon, coffee, and warm bread. Familiar things. Human things. I stood near the counter waiting for my order when I heard my name. "Evelyn Carter." "I thought that was you." I turned and nearly smiled with genuine surprise. Arthur Bennett stood beside the pastry display, wearing a camel overcoat and dark leather gloves dusted lightly with snow. Arthur chaired several major charity boards across Massachusetts and had known my late husband for decades. We had not spoken in nearly a year. "Arthur," I said warmly, "you are looking well." "Trying to," he replied with a tired laugh. "I heard Vanessa is taking over planning for the Winter Arts Gala this year." Something flickered behind his expression then. Mild confusion, perhaps. "Actually," he said slowly, "I assumed you were." I blinked once. "No one mentioned it to me." Arthur frowned slightly. "That is strange. Your family foundation has chaired the event for almost 20 years. A strange coldness moved quietly through me despite the warmth of the bakery. "Vanessa told the board you wanted to step back from public responsibilities," Arthur continued carefully. "She said retirement had become emotionally difficult for you." Retirement. Emotionally difficult. The words settled into place with terrible precision. Suddenly the place card from Thanksgiving made more sense. Family sponsor. Not matriarch. Not founder. Sponsor. A woman useful for funding things while remaining politely invisible. Arthur must have noticed something change in my face because his tone softened immediately. "Evelyn," he said gently, "are you all right?" I looked toward the bakery window where snowflakes melted slowly against the glass. Outside, people hurried through the cold carrying shopping bags and coffee cups while holiday lights blinked softly above Charles Street. Life continuing normally while entire relationships quietly rearranged themselves beneath the surface. "I think," I said carefully, "I may have been absent from my own life longer than I realized." Arthur studied me for a moment before nodding slowly. "Well," he said, adjusting his gloves, "for what it is worth, there are still many rooms in this city where your name carries more respect than you know." After he left, I remained standing beside the pastry counter holding my coffee without drinking it. Vanessa had not simply isolated me inside my family. She had started repositioning me socially too. Quietly, elegantly. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, something calmer settled over my thoughts. Clarity. Because for the first time, I could finally see the shape of the game clearly. And once you see the board, you stop being afraid of the player. That afternoon, I returned home carrying far more than coffee and pastries. The cold air followed me briefly inside the townhouse before the heavy front door closed behind me with a quiet thud. I removed my gloves slowly in the hallway, my thoughts moving carefully through everything Arthur had said at the bakery. "Vanessa told the board you wanted to step back." Such a harmless sentence on the surface. Respectful even. But beneath it lived something else entirely. Permission. Permission for people to stop expecting me in rooms I once helped build. Permission for my absence to become normal. I hung my coat neatly beside the staircase and stood still for a moment listening to the house settle around me. The old radiator hissed softly upstairs. Somewhere outside, tires rolled carefully over slushy pavement. I realized then that Vanessa's greatest talent was not cruelty. It was presentation. She never pushed people directly. She arranged circumstances so elegantly that everyone believed they had reached conclusions on their own. By early evening, snow had thickened across Beacon Hill, covering rooftops and iron fences in soft white layers. I lit the fireplace in the living room and opened the storage cabinet beneath the built-in shelves where I kept old foundation records and event portfolios. Leather folders, guest lists, donation ledgers, Photographs from nearly 2 decades of charity work throughout Boston. I spent years helping organize hospital fundraisers, scholarship galas, museum restorations, literacy programs. My late husband used to joke that I knew more senators and symphony donors than most political consultants. I stopped suddenly while flipping through one particular folder from 6 years earlier. Inside sat a handwritten note from Vanessa. Thank you for making me feel included tonight. I hope one day I can do this as gracefully as you. I stared at the elegant handwriting for a long time. The strange thing about manipulation is that it rarely begins with hatred. Often it begins with admiration. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. Daniel. I watched his name glow across the screen before answering calmly. Hello, sweetheart. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded distracted, like someone walking from room to room while speaking. I heard you saw Arthur Bennett today. Of course, Vanessa already knew. Information traveled quickly in houses where image mattered more than honesty. I did, I replied. It was a pleasant surprise. A pause followed. Vanessa mentioned you seemed upset at Thanksgiving. I almost smiled at the wording. Not hurt. Not excluded. Upset. An emotional inconvenience. Did she? Mom. Daniel sighed quietly. You know how Vanessa jokes sometimes. I walked slowly toward the fireplace and adjusted one of the logs with the poker. Bright orange sparks rose briefly before disappearing. Daniel, I said softly. When did your wife start speaking for me professionally? Silence. Just enough silence to answer the question before he finally spoke again. What do you mean? Arthur told me Vanessa informed the gala board I wished to step away from my responsibilities. Another pause. Longer this time. She was only trying to help reduce stress for you, he said carefully. You have been alone more lately. Alone. Such a polite word for abandoned. I lowered myself slowly into the armchair beside the fire. Did it ever occur to either of you, I asked quietly, that perhaps no one asked whether I wanted to disappear? Daniel exhaled heavily. Mom, nobody is trying to make you disappear. But even he sounded uncertain now. That mattered. Not because I wanted him to suffer guilt, but because certainty had finally cracked. I am tired tonight, I said gently. We can talk another time. He hesitated before replying. All right. Good night, Mom. Good night, Daniel. After the call ended, I sat quietly watching the fire for nearly an hour. The room glowed amber and gold while snow continued falling beyond the tall windows. My eyes drifted toward the old piano near the corner of the living room where Sophie used to practice Christmas songs as a little girl. I remembered her tiny hands struggling through the notes while Vanessa corrected her sharply from across the room. Even then, Sophie played more beautifully when her mother stopped speaking. That thought lingered with me longer than expected. Around 9:30, another message appeared from Sophie. Dad sounded nervous after talking to you. I stared at the words before setting the phone down slowly on the table beside me. Somewhere deep beneath all the polished dinners and careful smiles, something inside their perfect little structure had shifted tonight. Only slightly, but enough. And for the first time in years, I no longer felt like the weakest person in the room. The following week, I stopped reaching first. I did not call Daniel to ask about his meetings downtown. I did not text Vanessa holiday recipes she would never use. I did not remind Sophie to wear a scarf when temperatures dropped below freezing. For years, I had been quietly maintaining the emotional temperature of our family like a woman tending a fire no one else noticed. The moment I stopped, the silence became impossible to ignore. Monday passed quietly. Then Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, my phone finally rang while I was arranging fresh flowers in the dining room. Vanessa. I let it ring twice before answering. Good morning, I said calmly. Evelyn. She replied brightly, though her voice carried the faint strain of someone trying to sound relaxed. We have not heard from you in days. I was beginning to worry. I placed white roses carefully into the crystal vase before responding. That is thoughtful of you. A pause followed. Vanessa was accustomed to controlling the rhythm of conversations. Short answers unsettled people like her because silence leaves room for observation. Daniel thinks you might still be upset about Thanksgiving, she continued smoothly. I hope you know nobody intended to hurt your feelings. There it was again. Feelings. As though exclusion were merely an emotional misunderstanding instead of a carefully repeated pattern. I appreciate the concern, I said gently, but I have simply been busy. Another pause. Longer this time. Busy with what? I almost smiled. Not because the question was rude, because it was revealing. Vanessa did not ask out of curiosity. She asked because suddenly she could not see me clearly anymore. And people lose confidence the moment they lose visibility over someone else. Life, I replied softly. It can become surprisingly full once you stop spending all your time proving you belong. Silence. Real silence this time. Then Vanessa gave a small laugh that sounded slightly too polished. Well, I am glad you are doing well. Thank you. We ended the call politely, but something had shifted underneath it. I could feel her recalculating already. That evening, I attended a private arts council dinner downtown at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. My first public event in nearly 8 months. The ballroom shimmered with golden chandeliers while waiters moved elegantly between tables carrying wine glasses and silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. Normally, events like these exhausted me lately. Tonight, they energized me. Not because I needed attention, because I remembered who I had been before shrinking became a survival skill. Arthur Bennett greeted me near the entrance with visible relief. There she is, he announced warmly. Boston was beginning to think you retired to Vermont. Several guests laughed softly as they turned toward me with genuine affection. I noticed something important immediately. None of these people viewed me as fragile. That image existed only inside the version of me Vanessa had been quietly presenting. Throughout dinner, people approached my table constantly. A museum director asked for advice about a fundraising campaign. A university trustee invited me to speak at a literacy event in January. One woman even squeezed my hand warmly and said, "You always bring grace into every room, Evelyn." Grace. Not burden. Not emotionally difficult. Grace. Around dessert, I excused myself briefly and walked toward the ladies' room down the long marble corridor lined with holiday garlands and soft candlelight. Halfway there, I heard a familiar voice near the entrance of the ballroom. Vanessa. I slowed instinctively before rounding the corner. She stood beside 2 women near the coat check area, wearing an elegant black coat and holding her phone tightly in one manicured hand. "I do not understand what changed," she whispered sharply. She suddenly started appearing everywhere again. One of the women shrugged carefully. "Maybe she was never as withdrawn as you thought." Vanessa's jaw tightened slightly. "No, she was pulling away. I made sure of it." I stood perfectly still behind the corner, hidden by the tall arrangement of evergreen branches beside the hallway mirror. For a moment, the entire world became very quiet. Not because her words shocked me anymore, but because hearing them aloud confirmed something deeper. Vanessa never wanted peace between us. She wanted absence. And suddenly, for the first time since Thanksgiving, I understood the true reason she felt threatened now. It was never my age, never my opinions, never even my relationship with Daniel. It was my visibility. Because the moment people started seeing me clearly again, the version of me she created began collapsing. December arrived sharply in Boston that year. The city glittered with white lights wrapped around iron railings and bare trees while cold winds swept through narrow streets, carrying the smell of snow and chimney smoke. For the first time in years, I stopped waiting for invitations that came too late or conversations designed to make me feel grateful for crumbs of inclusion. Instead, I rebuilt my own routines quietly. Tuesday mornings became gallery meetings downtown. Thursday afternoons belonged to the Literacy Foundation. On Sundays, I attended chamber music performances with Margaret instead of sitting alone beside my phone hoping Daniel might call. It amazed me how quickly life expands once you stop shrinking yourself to fit inside someone else's comfort. Vanessa noticed. Of course she did. People who rely on control become deeply unsettled when their audience stops reacting properly. 2 weeks before Christmas, Daniel invited me to dinner unexpectedly. "Nothing formal," he said over the phone. "Just family. Family." The words sounded careful now, as though he no longer fully understood what it meant either. Snow covered the sidewalks the evening I arrived at their house. Warm yellow light glowed through the windows while instrumental Christmas music drifted softly from hidden speakers inside. Vanessa opened the door wearing a cream-colored sweater dress and the same polished smile she used at charity events. "Evelyn," she said brightly, "you look wonderful." I did look well. Better than I had in years, actually. My silver hair had been freshly styled that afternoon, and the dark navy coat Margaret convinced me to buy fit perfectly against my shoulders. More importantly, I no longer carried myself like someone apologizing for existing. During dinner, Vanessa performed warmth beautifully. She complimented the scarf I wore. asked polite questions about the Literacy Foundation, refilled my wine glass before it emptied. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect daughter-in-law. That was always her greatest talent. Not cruelty, plausibility. Halfway through dinner, Sophie caught my eye briefly across the table and gave the smallest, almost invisible smile. Daniel noticed it too. I could tell because he looked suddenly uncomfortable without understanding why. Actually, Vanessa said suddenly while cutting her salmon carefully, I ran into Melissa Granger yesterday. Melissa chaired one of the largest arts committees in the city. She mentioned seeing you at the council dinner recently. I nodded calmly. It was a lovely evening. Vanessa smiled thinly. I was surprised, honestly. I thought public events had become exhausting for you lately. There it was. Soft enough to sound concerned. Sharp enough to diminish. Daniel lowered his fork slowly. Sophie became very still beside him. I dabbed my napkin lightly against my glass before answering. Only the wrong rooms are exhausting, I said gently. Silence settled briefly over the table. Vanessa gave a quiet laugh, but her eyes hardened for half a second too long. Daniel shifted in his chair. Mom has always been better at those events than anyone, he admitted unexpectedly. People still ask about her all the time. The room changed slightly after that, almost imperceptibly, but I felt it. Vanessa felt it too. She recovered quickly, of course. She always did. Well, she replied smoothly. People do love tradition. Tradition, another carefully selected word. Old-fashioned, decorative, temporary. But this time, something surprising happened. Sophie spoke before I could. Grandma is not tradition, she said quietly without looking up from her plate. She is the reason most of those people even know our family. The silence afterward stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Vanessa stared at her daughter in complete surprise. Daniel looked between them uncertainly, as though seeing an unfamiliar version of his own family forming in front of him. Sophie finally lifted her eyes calmly. What? She asked softly. It is true. No one answered immediately. Outside, snow tapped lightly against the dining room windows while candlelight flickered gently across crystal glasses and silverware. The room looked beautiful. Perfect, even. But perfection becomes fragile the moment honesty enters it. After dessert, Vanessa disappeared into the kitchen alone for several minutes. When she returned, her smile looked tighter around the edges. I realized then that she was beginning to lose something she once believed was permanent. Narrative. For years, Vanessa controlled every emotional current inside this family simply by defining reality before anyone else could question it. But now Sophie had interrupted the script. Daniel had hesitated, and I had stopped volunteering for the role of invisible woman. The structure was still standing, but cracks had finally become visible. 3 days before Christmas, the Winter Arts Gala filled the grand ballroom of the Boston Harbor Hotel with gold light, orchestra music, and the low, elegant hum of wealthy people pretending not to measure one another constantly. Snow drifted slowly beyond the tall windows overlooking the harbor, while servers moved through the room, carrying champagne beneath towering arrangements of white orchids and evergreen branches. For nearly 20 years, my family foundation helped fund this event. Tonight was the first year Vanessa planned it herself. I arrived alone just after 7 wearing a black velvet gown and my late husband's diamond earrings. The moment I stepped inside the ballroom, several people turned immediately. Not out of pity, recognition. Arthur Bennett approached first with his usual warm confidence. You finally brought life back into this room, he said, kissing my cheek lightly. Nearby guests smiled and greeted me one after another. A museum director asked about the literacy expansion project. A senator's wife complimented my speech from years earlier at the Children's Hospital fundraiser. Everywhere I turned, people remembered me clearly. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood beside Daniel near the stage entrance. Even from a distance, I saw her expression tighten almost invisibly each time another guest approached me first instead of her. She looked beautiful, of course. She always did. Silver gown, perfect posture, perfect smile. But tonight something underneath the performance seemed strained. During cocktail hour, I overheard 2 women near the dessert table discussing the evening. I thought Mrs. Carter retired from public events. One whispered softly. The other glanced toward me. Apparently not. Honestly, she seems more respected than half the board. Vanessa heard them too. I could tell because her smile disappeared for half a second before returning brighter than before. Around 8:30, Dinner guests gathered near the stage while soft piano music drifted through the ballroom. Vanessa stepped gracefully to the microphone wearing the expression of someone fully prepared to own a room. "Good evening, everyone," she began smoothly. "Thank you for supporting another year of art, education, and community growth." Polite applause followed. She spoke beautifully, controlled, elegant, safe. Then, near the end of her speech, she smiled toward my table. "And of course," she added lightly, "we are grateful for the generations before us who helped begin this tradition, even if it is now time for newer leadership to carry things forward." Several guests nodded politely. On the surface, it sounded harmless, respectful even, but I recognized the sentence for what it truly was. A public farewell disguised as gratitude. Vanessa wanted the room to see me as ceremonial, historic, finished. I lowered my wine glass calmly. Then something unexpected happened. Arthur Bennett stood up before the applause fully settled. "Actually," he said loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear, "there would not even be a foundation without Evelyn Carter." The room quieted immediately. Arthur turned toward the audience with complete ease. "Most people here know this already, but Mrs. Carter built the original scholarship network herself back when this city barely funded public arts programs at all." More heads turned toward me now. Several older board members began nodding immediately. One woman near the front table laughed softly. She practically bullied half of Boston into donating money for children's literacy. The room warmed instantly with genuine laughter and recognition. Vanessa remained frozen beside the microphone, still smiling, but no longer controlling the atmosphere. Another board member stood up. "Evelyn recruited me into the foundation 20 years ago," he said proudly. "I doubt any of us would be sitting here tonight without her." Applause started softly, then spread across the ballroom until nearly everyone joined in. Not dramatic applause, respectful applause. The kind earned slowly over decades instead of manufactured through image management. I stayed seated through all of it. Calm, composed. I did not need to perform humility because true recognition no longer frightened me. Across the room, Daniel stared at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in years. Clarity, as though he suddenly realized how much of my life existed beyond the smaller version Vanessa kept presenting at home. Vanessa thanked everyone quickly and moved the program forward, but the balance of the evening had already shifted permanently. People approached my table constantly afterward. They wanted stories, advice, conversation. Meanwhile, Vanessa drifted through the ballroom, smiling too brightly, while checking her phone every few minutes as though searching for control she could no longer fully recover. Near the end of the night, Sophie slipped quietly into the empty chair beside mine and leaned close enough for only me to hear. "Dad finally sees it," she whispered softly. I looked across the ballroom toward Daniel standing alone near the stage, watching Vanessa with an expression filled less with admiration now and more with uncertainty. Then I turned back toward the glittering harbor outside the windows where snow continued falling gently across the dark water. Some truths arrive loudly. Others simply become impossible to ignore. Christmas morning arrived quietly beneath fresh snow and pale winter sunlight spilling across Beacon Hill. Church bells echoed softly through the cold air while smoke curled from brick chimneys lining the narrow streets. I woke before dawn out of habit and stood for a long moment beside my bedroom window, watching the city slowly brighten beneath white rooftops and frozen sidewalks. For years, Christmas had felt like performance. Careful conversations, careful smiles, careful efforts to avoid becoming inconvenient inside my own family. This year felt different, not because everything had been repaired, but because I finally stopped confusing silence with peace. Around 10 o'clock, I baked cinnamon rolls while Nat King Cole played softly from the radio in the kitchen. The townhouse smelled warm and familiar again. Real again. At 11:15, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I opened the door, Daniel stood outside alone, holding a small bakery box dusted lightly with snowflakes. For a second, he looked strangely young to me. Not physically, emotionally. Like the boy who used to hesitate before admitting he broke something important. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said quietly. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." He stepped inside slowly, brushing snow from his coat sleeves while the warmth of the house wrapped around us both. "I brought those lemon pastries you like from Hanover Street," he added awkwardly. I smiled faintly. "You remembered." We sat in the kitchen with coffee between us while soft music drifted through the house. Daniel looked exhausted. Not from work. From realization. There is a specific kind of fatigue that comes when someone finally notices truths they ignored for years. He stared down into his coffee for several seconds before speaking. Sophie told me about the group chat. I said nothing. I did not know Vanessa was saying those things about you. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Maybe I should have known. Snow tapped lightly against the kitchen windows while the radiator hissed softly near the hallway. The whole house felt still enough to hear honesty clearly. Daniel, I said gently. People rarely become cruel overnight. He closed his eyes briefly. I think I kept telling myself avoiding conflict was kindness. I looked at my son carefully then. Really looked at him. The gray beginning near his temples. The tiredness beneath his eyes. The quiet shame sitting heavily across his shoulders. Avoiding conflict often protects the person causing harm, I said softly. Not the person receiving it. He nodded slowly without arguing, because deep down he already knew. After a long silence, Daniel finally whispered the question that mattered most. Why did you never tell me how bad it had become? I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup before answering. Because every time I tried, you defended her before listening to me. The truth settled heavily between us. Painful, but clean. Daniel looked toward the dining room, where old family photographs lined the hallway wall. I thought she was helping hold the family together, he admitted quietly. I almost smiled. No, sweetheart. She was controlling the version of the family everyone else was allowed to see. Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Not avoidance. Reflection. Finally, Daniel looked at me with tears gathering faintly in his eyes. I am sorry, Mom. I believed him. That was the surprising part. Not because apologies erase damage. They do not. But because for the first time in years, his apology belonged to me instead of his own discomfort. Around noon, the front door opened again, and Sophie burst inside carrying snow on her boots and a wrapped package in her arms. Grandma, she laughed, hugging me tightly. Behind her, Vanessa stood quietly in the doorway. No polished performance. No perfect smile. Just stillness. She removed her gloves slowly before meeting my eyes. Merry Christmas, Evelyn, she said softly. I noticed immediately that this was the first time in years she had spoken my name without hidden sharpness beneath it. Merry Christmas, I replied calmly. We stood there for a moment surrounded by cinnamon, pine garlands, and falling snow outside the windows. No grand confrontation came. No dramatic speech. Real endings rarely arrive that way. Instead, something quieter happened. Vanessa finally understood I was never competing with her for power inside this family. I simply refused to disappear so she could feel secure. Later that afternoon, while Sophie played Christmas music softly on the piano and snow continued falling across Boston, Vanessa approached me near the fireplace holding 2 cups of tea. How did you do it? She asked quietly. Do what? Stay so calm. I looked toward the glowing Christmas tree reflected gently in the dark window beside us. Then I smiled softly and answered with the simplest truth I knew. I stopped needing your permission to matter.